Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Ross, Christian, and Brian hosts national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. Join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money and the home as a team sent to your inbox every couple of weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. This week, we are honored to welcome Rob Cross, who is the Edward A. Madden Professor of Global Leadership at Babson College and co-founder and current research director of the Connected Commons, a consortium of over 100 leading organizations accelerating network research and practice. Rob is also the author of the recently released The Microstress Effect. For today's show, Rob will bring to life best practices that show you how to build resilience against microstress, and ultimately how to find purpose in your everyday life using it as an antidote to your own microstress. Enjoy today's show. Rob, thanks so much for joining us.
No, it's great to be here. I appreciate it very much.
Well, we ran into your work in the Harvard Business Review, and you wrote a really great piece on microstress, and it spoke loudly to me because it really plays into so many different aspects of our lives. And sadly, it's just not talked about enough. And if we could talk about it and recognize it and address it, I feel like that we would all be better personally and professionally. And so we're obviously going to talk about this during the podcast, but we want to start with understanding the origin of your passion for microstress.
Sure. So, it's funny, to be honest. I'm a professor at Babson College, and I also run this group called the Connected Commons. So that's a group of about 150 organizations that sponsor research into looking at the role of relationships, networks, connectivity in a series of different things in organizations. So the basis of this study was actually pushed on me, I have to admit, by my consortium members. I was presenting work we'd done on high performers in a book I published a couple of years ago. And this is about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the consortium meetings. And I remember at the time, somebody in the back raised their hand and said, well, can you also not just think about high performers, but understand the connections of people that are happier and thriving in their work and life? And at the time, I just kind of groaned inwardly, because all that anybody cared about then 5 or 6 years ago was innovation. and it was very much where I'd planned to take us, but I always follow the consortium's direction, and it's always paid off enormously well on this. And so it started this heavy focus on looking at what are the positive ways that connections in our lives impact our well-being. So there's a ton of evidence, that if we get clinically lonely, right, or lose people that we can turn to for support or things like that, like 1 in 3 Americans are. And it's horrendous. The mortality rate is as high as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I mean, there's just a ton of negative evidence of the impact of not having the right connections in your life. But then all these books will come out and say, well, you need 2 best friends, right? really close to. And, one study even showed it takes about 200 hours to go from casual acquaintance to best friend status. So, I mean, who has that time, at the end of the day? And I'm assuming that I would guess right. And, one of you guys would give me your 200 hours too. It's just it's a challenge. And so we were focused on how do connections have a positive impact on well-being in the sense of our physical health, our sense of growth in and out of work, our sense of purpose in life, and resilience. And I was in the very first interview doing this. We have hundreds that we did. And I asked this woman, life science executive, lovely British accent, I won't try to mimic here. And I just said, can you tell me about a time you were becoming more physically healthy in your life? And not what you did, but what was the role of the connections around you? Because I really wanted to understand the nature of the interactions that were having impact there. And she just laughed for a second and then said, well, Rob, I was the person in high school that dodged gym at every chance I could. It had nothing to do with physical activity. And that worked for me up until kind of my late 30s, right? Where profession and personal life had just taken over, and her health was declining to the point that her doctor said, you need to do something, right, about this. And so her solution was she started walking around a park, outside her flat in London. And she happened to be bumping into people that were walking at the same time. And so they started walking together, and it led to a longer walk and then a charity walk and a charity run. And you flash forward 10 years to when I was speaking with her, and she was scheduling vacations with her husband and some of those people where they would run a marathon first, and this was the person that had been 10 years earlier. You had no interest in physical activity, and she'd morphed who she was to being physically fit, but also with running as a piece of her identity. What she would tell me is the identity of being a runner helped push back on work, right? And some of the stress of work. The authenticity of the connections with this different group of people. Suddenly she wasn't just hanging out with life science executives. There was an auto mechanic, a surgeon, other people that just saw life differently. She saw them at their worst. They saw her at her worst. And it created dimensionality in her life that was amazing really for her. And so then I made this fatal mistake, and this is answering your question, the basis of the story, but I had to build up to it. 45 minutes into this 90-minute interview, I said, what got you in trouble? Like, how is it? Because you got to imagine this woman is smart, funny, charismatic, like everything. I'm like, well, how did you get to a point that you had to have a doctor say you need to do something, right, about this, so you're not going to make it? And the interview went from 100 miles a minute down to nothing. And she's just staring there, looking at me through the lens. And she finally said, I don't know, really, just life, I guess. And that got me super interested. Yeah, well, what does that mean? We spent the next 45 minutes saying, what are these small moments that are accumulating around you? And then I carried that forward into hundreds of interviews. And what we could really see is that people had big stress. Occasionally there'd be health issues, nasty clients, demanding bosses, things like that. But that wasn't what was choking people. What was choking people was this accumulation of the small moments and the stresses that were coming at us through connections in our lives, given how hyper-connected we are. And that's really the basis of how we discovered it. We were focused more on what are the positive aspects of relationships, and that's the second half of the book. But what we really found is the happier people, they're better at dealing with these micro moments. And that was the thing we really kind of leaned into with the work there. So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but there was a trajectory.
No, that makes so much sense. And as you're sharing this, what comes to mind is that in the moments that I'm least proud of, where I've lost my temper or gotten angry or whatever it may be, it's not necessarily that singular moment. It's like these compounding moments where it's like somebody's just kind of punched me in the arm, where one punch is no big deal, but after 5,000, eventually you just lose it.
Right.
So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that.
And that's the nature of it. All the problem is, from a neuroscience standpoint, these things don't invoke fight or flight response, right? So they just kind of sit beneath our radar. There's stuff that of course we handle, right? But our bodies experience the stress as if it was big stress, right? We have our blood, pressure going up, our heart rates go up. There's even one study that showed that if we eat a meal within 2 hours of being under this form of social stress, right, coming at us from others, we metabolize that meal, adding 104 calories to it than if we weren't under that social stress.
Wow.
So it has a lot of effects physically on us. And that's exactly what we would hear, from a lot of people, either day to day, at some point you just say enough and you snap, or the worst stories for me were people that went 3, 5, 8 years in their lives and they just woke up one day and said, I am way away from who I meant to be. I've just fallen into this pattern of behavior and need to change things. And it was always exactly that, the accumulation of the small that was what choked them out.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think, as you said in that first interview, that there's that common response of, well, just life happens. So it's so easy to write off all these small little micro stresses that happen, but it's really, as you're saying, the accumulation, the compounding effect of all of them adding up together. It's fascinating to think about. So I guess if we started kind of digging down a little bit more, can you tell us a little bit more about how this microstress impacts an individual's overall well-being, their productivity in the workplace? I mean, how is it really impacting them?
Yeah. So, I mean, what we could see is that it was, again, I love that idea of just that one last punch to the arm. People would talk about it as children jumping on a bed. It's all fine until that one last one, comes in. And it's created situations where most of us, our heads hit the pillow at night and we're exhausted, but we can't quite put a finger on what just happened, right? And it's different. Yeah. It's different than disassociated stress, that may happen as a product of the war, or social justice issues or the economy. These things are things that are coming at us through connections in our lives, right? And if I happen to dislike you or you're frustrating me, in this moment, it spikes me even further, and counter to that, a lot of microstress is also created by people we love and care about, right? And so if that hits me and it's somebody that I'm worried about, a parent, a daughter, whatever it may be, then that spikes it even higher. And so what we know is it's definitely a big factor in burnout and all the burnout epidemic that we talk about right now. We've gone through COVID, and the volume of possibilities, the way we're so hyper-connected outside and inside of work, has shot up the level of stress we're experiencing this way. And then the interesting thing to me is we've lost the dimensionality in our lives. The social distancing pulled us out of these groups that helped us cope with it to begin with. So usually I could see the happier people in my work, they tended to have at least 2 and usually 3 groups they were an authentic part of, like my marathon runner, that I've been. And that just keeps things in perspective, right? You just see the world differently. And that's lost too, right? Coming out of COVID. So we're really kind of been pinched on both sides, if you will, with the way that we're experiencing burnout today.
So knowing that the modern world of work has changed to, for many, not everyone, to either remote work or a hybrid work environment. Are there different types of microstresses? So I guess this is a 2-part question.
Yeah.
And if there are, how do you mitigate those?
Yeah. So I'll take the first one, and then let's come back to the second idea. We could see, going through all these interviews, hundreds and hundreds of them, we could see that there were 14 pretty consistent stressors in people's lives. 5 of them had to do with things that drain our capacity. They hurt our ability to get done what we need to get done. And this would take the form of misalignment, with colleagues. It's become hugely prevalent as we have so many organizations in agile or cross-functional team-based work, right, where people agree in the room, they pull in different directions. But people would talk about some of their worst career experiences being misalignment, not handled early. It can be small performance misses, right, with people that you're working with. And part of the problem today in most modern organizations is we're maybe staffed on one team, but we're usually part of 4, 5, or 6 collaborative efforts or teams. And if you happen to own one with 4 other people and they're busy on their own 5 or 6 teams and they show up to your effort, 95% done, right? So they're almost done to what you agreed to. That 4 people times 5% miss means 20% to you, right? And so it's the way that the interconnected nature of work is happening as it creates these points where small misses matter and have, pretty big impact for people. And then you're stuck going, well, do I work through the night or do I underdeliver, right? Both of which create stress. So there were 5 things, right, in terms of interactions that just hurt our ability to get done what we needed to get done. There were another series that had to do with the emotional impact of interactions. And that could be certainly confrontational conversations or traditionally negative things, but it also had an awful lot to do with, worrying about people you care about in your life, right? So it turns out that my, biggest source of purpose in my life is this beautiful young woman named Rachel. That's my daughter, 23-year-old, going into med school now. We spend a ton of time together. She, a source of inspiration for me, source of laughter. She calls me Baldy all the time. I mean, just wonderful relationship. My primary microstressor in my life is Rachel, the same exact person, right? Because she is a constant source of, surges in work that I have to take care of, or she passes on secondhand stress to me, where she is just, thinking about something that's bugging her for 5 seconds, sends it to me. I worry about it for 3 hours, And so you see that, right, and kind of the emotional impact of their interactions that you're trying to shift and not necessarily the relationship. And then the last category was around interactions that just challenge our identity, right, and who we think we are as people. And you would hear things there around, for example, aggressive revenue goals for salespeople that suddenly they're or sell things they don't believe in, or the physicians in my interviews, they're questioning, all the time they put into med school and everything else, and suddenly they're not able to take care of patients at the way that they had historically wanted. And so what we see, and I'm not obviously walking through all 14, but these 3 categories around drains to capacity, emotional impact and challenges to identity. And what we did in table 5, chapter 5, was you use a table that's something I've been doing a ton with right now, where on the left-hand column, we have all the 14 microstressors, and across the top, we have the consistent sources a boss, colleagues, loved ones, etc. And what I found really helpful for people is to go through that table, and I'll say, I want you to give me 90 seconds, and I want you to go through and identify 3 or 4 micro stresses that are systemic enough in your life that you should do something about it, right? And it just gets them down to a couple of small moments that they can start to work with, which we know actually really matters for a bunch of reasons. Then I'll have them go through it again, and I'll say, well, which micro stresses are you causing others, unnecessarily? And people are always like, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. I'm just thinking about what I'm experiencing, not what I'm causing. But what we could see through the interviews is that the stress we unnecessarily cause almost always boomerangs back on us in a different. And then the third pass is to say, where are you just, making a mountain out of a molehill? Where do you need to back away and keep perspective in situations? And that's really the merit of these kind of groups outside of work, right? It just expands who we worry about. But I find that people can really get precision on a small set of actions that way, that they can then go do something different about. And it's a pretty powerful way to shift it. Last comment, and then I'll stop here, is it's really worth doing in that, we know through all of social psychology, the negative interactions have 3 to 5 times the impact of the positive, right, in our lives. And yet very rarely do we think about how to shape the negative. We do yoga, meditation, mindfulness, things like that allow us to persist, but we don't do a lot to shape it. And so I think looking at—
What does that mean when you say shape the negative?
Well, like with my daughter, Rachel, right? We discovered this over a glass of wine one night that she didn't even care when she was sending me these texts about, here's the bad thing that went on. Just a knee-jerk reaction of what she was used to. And I was like, Rach, I think about this for 3 or 4 hours. And it doesn't matter to you. Let's talk about not sending what doesn't matter. And she did it, right? And if anything, the relationship is better in some ways, because when I get something from her, I know it's serious and we follow up on it quickly. But the taking those interactions out of has had a material impact on my well-being. A couple of times a week, I'm not worried, in small moments. So that's what I mean. It's a subtle distinction. I find that too often people look at the relationship. They say, this person's driving me crazy and I got to get rid of them. Whereas if you shift it and say, what's the interaction that's happening? You have a lot more traction to think about how do you adapt things in different ways.
Very interesting. Yeah. So you've talked about the role that this micro stress plays between you and your daughter. I'm curious, since that we are a podcast about modern husbands, how the accumulation of micro stress, especially over time or the length of a relationship, really plays into the marriage.
Yeah, I think in a bunch of different ways. There's different expectations that get created, right, for either party as a product of how they kind of learn to interact, right? And I think what we've seen is the couples, as I went through it, that did better, I thought, was interesting, is they would systematically set out goals for who they wanted to be as a couple. And a lot of times that's society kind of defines this idea that we can all have it all. And that's a great notion, but I found that people that tended to do better, they were figuring out who do we want to be together, and they would not just have date nights, but they would actually set goals and talk about, what's happening and are we doing this, well or not. One interview I did, and I actually ended up interviewing both sides of this relationship. They gave each other report cards, once every other week. And now they were doing on these 4 or 5.
Graded report cards?
Literally. And I mean, these were really positive things. Like, we want to be a part of the community, right? Or we want to be physically healthy, right? It's just kind of being clear that we want to be doing. And then, how are you doing individually? How are you doing supporting me? And it just is a way to pivot the behavior, you know what I mean? And start to take small stresses out of the moment. So I thought that was a pretty important thing in general, is that the people were living more intentionally that way, but they were doing it with the person they're most interdependent with. And it just created a more positive.
Well, when you initially said report card, I immediately, it's like my high school days were flashing back.
Yeah.
And I started, you see that. Yeah, I was like, no, I wouldn't do that.
Called the micro stressor for Brian.
Oh, okay. thinking about like she's going to have line items like out dinner, but the way that you explained it, like when you think about the dynamics of a relationship and how ultimately you're just your teammates and you want to support each other, but finding specific ways to do that, such as physical activity, and then just reflecting upon how well you were able to support one another to be more active and discussing just that specific thing, I can immediately see how that would lead to a healthier lifestyle. And along those lines, are there effective strategies or interventions that just us as individuals can adopt to manage and cope with the microstresses that we face on a daily basis?
Yeah. So if I look at what I'll call on my 10 percenters, and they were the people that were really kind of doing really well from a performance standpoint and a life standpoint in the work I would do. And so you have to imagine you do hundreds of these interviews and they're all highly successful people from great organizations. And so the first 10 minutes of every discussion, it was rainbows and lollipops. Like everything was great. People had the veneer on, and then you get down to minute 30 and 45 and the cracks come in. And, by the end of it, some people even joked up, about the difficulty of trying to be a good parent, right? And the context, being a primary breadwinner or whatever it was, right? The multiple pressures there. But about 10% never did. Right? They tended to stay high and the whole time. And there were two really, really key notions from them that I pulled away. One is they tended to live the small moments more authentically with others, right? They weren't defined by doing the big things. They may hike the Himalayas or they may sail the ocean, but the real thing that was creating this kind of sense of well-being or happiness was living the small moments more authentic, right? And so, an example of that, a Silicon Valley executive, super well-known organization. She was the head of the venture fund strategy for them. She'd been a runner all her life, right? And she came out of, I think it was Stanford. And she told me when I interviewed her, this is kind of mid-40s for her, she said, Rob, I made a huge mistake the first 20 years of my life of letting society define what running was good for. And by that, she meant, I dug into that, right? And she meant, if I didn't get a personal best time on the races I was running every year, it was a bad year for running, right? And that's not sustainable, but it was shaping how she was living her life, right? She would get up earlier and stretch and yoga and weight training and everything else. And she woke up one day and said, that's not what I'm interested in, right? That's somebody else's idea of fun, this personal best time. What I want to be doing is running with my daughter, her best friend, and a parent, right, in the community. And it evolved to this group of parents and children running to stay healthy. So the principle behind the story is she told me she'd never been happier, right, with what she was doing with running. Mm-hmm. But what she was doing was taking an activity she was already engaged in, right, running, and then saying, how do I pivot it just slightly to pull me into two groups I care about, my community and my family, right, and the relationships there. And again, I would find in general that if you look at things that way, we have a ton of opportunity, right, to just shape slightly some of the things we're doing to pull into, more authentic connections with people. And that was one of the big distinguishers, right, of the people that were happier. The second one is, and I'll say this probably 5 times today, so have at least 2 and usually 3 groups you're an authentic part of outside of your profession, right? I can see over and over again that people that became completely unidimensional on work and direct family, they suffered at the end. It was the people that maintained some engagement, in other groups, and that could come from all walks of life. Like my runner, it could be, music, religion, poetry, art, and all sorts of, ways of living and kind of building that in. But those were the kind of the 2 ideas that I could see consistently mattered the most in terms of the hacker.
As you're describing these things, I'm thinking back at the challenges we all faced during COVID, right? Boy, talk about a tough animal to tackle. It made life very stressful in ways that we probably didn't understand. And the microstresses that you're explaining and the ways that you deal with them really helped me understand some of those challenges, whether it's personal challenges or friends, family members telling you these things or just reading about them.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people, they will tell me, gosh, Rob, I've lost the dimensionality, right, in my life. I've fallen out of the groups. that I was a part of pre-pandemic. And if you've done that, there are kind of three strategies. One is to do what I just described. And in the book, we talk about these 8 sources of purpose that come from interactions with others. And it's an easy thing to say, how do I pivot something I'm either doing at work or outside of work in ways that pull me into those interactions more, just like the runner I was just telling you. Another one is to reach back to a passion from the past and use that to slingshot into a new group going forward. So one of my favorite interviews was the head of neurosurgery at one of the best hospitals in the world. And he wrote me about 3 or 4 months after we'd done the interviews with him. And he said, there's the subject line in the email said, Rob, I've joined a rock band. He was this austere, brilliant man. And apparently he'd come out of the discussions and said, yeah, I've gotten unidimensional, right? It's just my work and my direct family, and I need to do something. And his solution was he went to a guitar store and he was going to buy a guitar because he played guitar in high school. And as he was walking out the door, he passed by a flyer that said something like, we're looking for a guitar player. And what we lack in quality, we make up for in volume. And he ended up joining this group. And what he was writing me is he said, I'm hanging out with 20-year-olds. Having the time of my life. These guys will never be my best friends, right? But it is a group that's giving me perspective. It's allowing me to unplug. I see the world differently as a product of kind of, engaging there. And again, most people have that opportunity, right? A passion could be cooking. It could be pottery. It could be tennis. It could be anything, right? And use that to slingshot for it. And then the third one that my co-author and I experimented with was, it had been suggested by people that wrote The Good Life. Did you set up 7 8-minute calls one week? So just reach back to people, say, people you try to reestablish contact with, friends, whatever. And so I sent 7 people, can I talk to you for 8 minutes? And it's funny right out of the gate, right there. You want 8 minutes, not 8 minutes, 30 seconds. And yeah, bantering with you immediately, but nobody pushes an 8-minute phone call 2 months out, right? Right. They're like, yeah, we'll do this. And it always led to other things, right? And kind of reconnection that way. Karen, my co-author, put her challenge up on Facebook. She asked for 7. She got 42 people that wanted to, reconnect for 8 minutes. And so it was just an eye-opener for us about how much people are thirsting. And you just have to kind of put structure in some way to find ways back into these groups.
Did you know that the budgeting app Mint is going away at the end of 2023? This is Brian Page, founder of Modern Husbands. My wife and I used to use Mint, but found something better. Fortunately, before we learned of this news. What we found is safer, has more customizable tools, and has been easier for us to use to review our day-to-day finances during our money dates. Go to modernhusbands.com to learn about Tiller and how we use it. We are partnering with Tiller to create tutorials and resources just for couples who use Tiller. Once again, go to modernhusbands.com to learn about Tiller, and while you're there, be sure to join fellow Modern Husbands as bi-monthly newsletter subscribers and receive great ideas to manage money and the home as a team and a few free gifts when you subscribe. Now back to the show.
These are they're brilliant strategies. And I'm already just like, my mind is just going 100 miles per hour, just thinking, okay, this is how I can implement this is how I can implement that. And I really just love the concept of reintegrating diversity of perspective in your lives. Because I think, especially with, Brian was saying, like with the pandemic, we just kind of got into these little bubbles. And like when you expand this diversity of perspective, then you're expanding the diversity of your experiences. And
yeah, I mean, that's the magic of this, right? Suddenly it's whatever that activity is, it is creating that diversity of perspective around. Like you suddenly have something that you all have common interest in, right? And it could be intellectual, emotional, music, I mean, all sorts of things. But then you've suddenly got these different perspectives, right, that are built in as well, that you're like, it just helps you see life differently. It helps you value friendship differently. And it keeps us from getting so down in the weeds, in terms of the minutia, that it has a huge impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. Your research is putting so much context and linking so many things that I think a lot of us have been trying to put together for a long time now. So a lot of what you've been talking about is in your book, The Microstress Effect. Can you tell us a little bit more about like who your target audience is for this book? Like who's going to get the most benefit out of reading The Microstress Effect?
I think I think it's relevant to anybody that's in a professional capacity today. I think the demands that have been placed on that world is beyond anything we understand because of how hyper-connected things are. Most people I'll talk with today even are working across 6 or 7 ways to collaborate to get work done inside their company, right? It's meetings, emails, instant message, the team collaborative spaces. I mean, you go down it.
At least that amount.
Yeah, at least, right? And you've got, all these opportunities for, things to kind of come at you that way. And then simultaneously, we've hyper-connected ourselves on the personal front too, right? With text and everything else that we've got to be, immediately responsive to, immediately on. And so I think people are enmeshed in this in a way that's invisible. I mean, it's amazing to me when I was reading all those stats on the effect of being clinically lonely, that it would be literally the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, 26% greater mortality rate. I was looking at this going, why don't we pay attention to this? Why would we chase a cholesterol medication, a blood pressure medication down to the ends of the earth and then not look at either side of this coin, the positive connections or the negative? And for some reason, I think it's analytics. We don't have that to see, the effect that it's having on us. But I think especially for the professional audiences, we talked about this earlier, all these things just seem like what successful people get over, right? You just get over this, right? It's another small thing, you just deal with it. And you don't really think about how do I structure my life in a way that starts driving that now. And so I think that audience in particular is the one that'll have the biggest effect for all of us.
Well, I'm sure after listening to this, our listeners are going to want to hear you more and learn more from you. Where can folks learn and be connected with you? Where can they turn?
Yeah, so I have a website set up, robcross.org, and there's obviously a book page there, but we're just starting to put out a bunch of resources. So that page has 14 videos I shot on each of the microstresses. We just put an app up on the Apple Store that is called the Microstress Effect app, and it just allows people to go through these very quickly and then generate a personalized report, for themselves. So tons of ways like that to kind of reach back and engage with what we're up to here.
Well, I just wrote both of those down, and right when we're done with this, I'm going to download that app. This has been just such an insightful conversation. One of those that I'm going to walk away just thinking and reflecting on it for a long time. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to meet with us and share your wisdom with our listeners.
Great. Thank you all so much for the interest.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach and helps married couples learn how to manage money and the home as a team. And join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcast, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every couple of weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.